Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I'm your host, Kyle. Sorry I was out for the last week. I was in California visiting some family. I originally was going to try to have this episode up last Wednesday, but that didn't really end up working out, so here we are, because I'm not a professional, and I don't plan for things in advance. So here we are, a week late. Sorry about that. But today I'm going to be talking about something that I don't really know a whole lot about. That's one of the really neat things about doing this podcast is I'm learning a lot right along with you. My background is in Russian history, but Russian history is a very vast thing. It's the history of everything in Russia and everything that Russia has touched. All of the people, places, events, items that were in Russia at one point, are in Russia currently, or are linked to Russia somehow, are arguably Russian history. And I will spare you my entire lengthy discussion that I like to have about how the study of history is so much more vast than a lot of people like to think, but this is the really neat thing, is I'm also getting to learn quite a bit and looking into topics that I don't normally know a lot about and that I don't normally think about looking into. So today we're going to be talking about jewelry. Personally, I'm not a big jewelry guy. I don't wear it, I don't really own any, and I'm not a huge fan. I can appreciate the craftsmanship and the color and shine and the artistry of jewelry, but personally, it just doesn't really do anything for me. But this isn't just any jewelry. No, this is jewelry that serves a greater purpose. This is jewelry that lets me talk about Russian culture, and now I can get behind that. Today, we're talking Faberge. I imagine most of you know what Faberge is, or have some idea what Faberge is, and what they made, and why they're famous. But if not, then I highly recommend at some point you go ahead and look up the Faberge eggs, because that is what we are going to be discussing today. And a little bit of a note on looking up the Faberge eggs, I decided not to put in audio descriptions of the eggs, because there's a lot of them. And I didn't really know which ones I wanted to show off, which ones I wanted to point out. I don't really know enough to be like, oh, this is a really important one, you should know this one, versus this isn't that important. But the good news is Faberge is still an active company, and you can go to their website and you can see the eggs. There are lots of places where if you look up Faberge eggs, that being Faberge, and if you don't know how to spell eggs, then I can't help you. Look those up, and you will find tons and tons and tons of pictures. So I'm not going to be describing them, but you should go ahead and look them up because they really are works of art. They are gorgeous, they are very impressive, and they're really neat. So before we can discuss the eggs themselves, those being the most famous part of the Faberge lineage, we need to do a little background. In the year 1842, a man named Gustave Faberge founded a company called the House of Faberge in St. Petersburg, Russia. They made jewelry and watches and fancy decorative things for fancy people with too much money and not enough gold baubles. 4 years later, in 1846, Gustave had a son. The son's name was Peter Karl Faberge. Peter, because I'm not calling him Peter Karl, would follow in his father's footsteps in becoming a jeweler, and in the 1860s, Gustav would move his family out of St. Petersburg and into Dresden. While they were away, Gustav left the workshop in the hands of his most trusted workmen, and Peter studied to become a jeweler. In 1866, Peter returned to St. Petersburg and began working at the Faberge factory under the tutelage of a man named Hiskias Pendin. I'm certain I'm saying that wrong, but I am not even sure how the hell to do better, so sorry, Mr. Pendin. In 1882, Pendin dies, and Peter takes control of the Faberge company. And quickly, Peter Faberge, who I'm now going to be referring to by his last name, made a name for himself as a high-quality jewelry designer. Not long after Peter Faberge took over the company, the Tsar started purchasing items from Faberge in order to display them in the Hermitage. Or really, not so much in kind of the Hermitage as we think of it, but these were more so like in the Tsar's personal collection. It's really weird because the Hermitage is supposed to be like foreign art that the Tsar owns, but it's not always entirely the case, and it's kind of hard to say like, oh, this is the art part for display versus art part for the Tsar's personal consumption. Either way, he is putting these on display. So I guess that makes it proper Hermitage stuff? I don't know. But this would start a lengthy and very lucrative relationship for Mr. Faberge, because the Russian imperial family really fucking dug the stuff that he was making. And 3 years later, in 1885, the Tsar Alexander would come back to Faberge with a request. He wants an egg. An egg, you say? An egg, I say. Now, why on earth would the Tsar want an egg? And if he wanted an egg, couldn't he just go get one from, like, a chicken? He is the Tsar, right? I imagine that's not that hard. Well, because it's Easter. And who doesn't want an egg for Easter? Nothing quite says Jesus like this weird, round, fragile white thing that you can make omelets out of. And he doesn't just want any old egg. No, he wants a special Easter egg for his beloved wife, Maria Fedorovna. So, you're probably all familiar with the concept of Easter eggs, yeah? If not, that's on you. You can go figure that one out. Well, in Russia, both then and now, Easter eggs are a pretty big fucking deal. In most iterations of Christianity, Easter is as much a celebration of spring as it is of Jesus. The celebration isn't just about the rebirth of Jesus going up to heaven, but also of the rebirth of the planet after winter. This is why eggs are a big symbol. They stand for fertility and birth and life and, all of that good shit. So, in Russia, spring has a little bit more of a euphoric sense than it does in, well, say, San Antonio, Texas, where I am. In Russia, winter is bleak and long and hard, and bad and depressing and generally a really bummer for everyone involved. It's not like here where, 85 is pretty normal Christmas weather. So, there are some pretty raucous celebrations about the winter coming to an end and spring beginning. Easter is one of those. So, in celebration of Jesus' ascent to heaven, and also the end of being trapped inside freezing to death for months at a time, people exchange eggs. This is a tradition that is still really popular to this day. Generally, what is done is people paint wooden or even real eggs with a thick lacquered paint that hardens up nice and firm and holds its form when the egg inside eventually rots away, especially if it's a real egg. These eggs are generally painted with bright colors. Those are really neat and cool, like, these red and black geometric patterns. It's really neat. It's a very kind of traditional Russian design. There are oftentimes images of plants, berries, and other things that you can eat, because you can finally eat things. And also, it's very common that these would be painted with religious icons, pictures of saints, or images from the Bible, stuff like that. Again, it's kind of equal parts Jesus and yay, we're not freezing to death anymore, and now we can go outside and eat real food again. And now we have to take a little detour on our little detour. If you're familiar with Slavic painted eggs, then you're probably familiar with the art style known as pisanki. Pisanki is a very similar style to what we're talking about here, but is different in a few ways. Before, we were talking about Russian traditional Easter eggs. But pisanki, they're not Russian. They're Ukrainian. Well, Ukrainian-Polish. It gets a little kind of blurred because Ukraine and Poland don't really exist at this point. And pisanki are very common in both countries today. The word pisanki comes from the Ukrainian word pisati, which means to write. Pisanki itself are the eggs. A single egg would be a pisanka, and multiple would be pisanki. Pisanki eggs are very similar to their Russian counterparts in that they're generally colorful eggs that celebrate the arrival of spring and the end of winter. But they lack a little bit of the Christianization. There certainly is some, but where the Russian eggs are just as likely to have an icon or religious scene depicted on it, pisanki are fairly exclusively bright geometric patterns that evoke warmth, life, spirit of rebirth. And this tradition is ancient, dating back so long that we're not entirely sure when it started. But we do know that it started well before Christianity came anywhere near the people of the region. And not only are pisanki a sign of the return of life after a harsh winter, they're often considered good luck charms, and there are a number of Ukrainian folk stories that focus on eggs in general, and pisanki in specific, and their good luck abilities. While similar to their Russian counterparts, I wanted to take a second to point out that pisanki are different. There's a lot of talk, especially lately, about how Russia and Ukraine are kind of the same, and that's not true. They are, of course, right next to each other, and their cultures have influenced each other for thousands of years, and people have moved back and forth basically constantly between the two countries for, well, thousands of years, and even thousands of years before there were modern states, certainly the modern states that we know today. So this means that there are a lot of similarities, and there are also just a lot of Ukrainians in Russia and a lot of Russians in Ukraine, or well, ones who didn't invade anyways, who brought their own cultures and customs with them and brought different cultures and customs back. Aside from the kind of general lack of Christianization, there is another difference between pisanki and the Russian style of painting. That being that pisanki aren't actually painted with a lacquer paint, they're painted with wax. The painting style of Russian eggs, which is generally what we think of as the, Slavic decorated Easter eggs, are called malivanki. And to make things even more exciting and confusing, there's also the tradition of egg painting called kraslitsi, which also uses wax but is more common in Western Slavic cultures like Slovakia, Czechia, and Poland. But yeah, I hope you're nice and confused now. But I'm going to have to kind of leave it at that. I am not super familiar with the different types of egg art, and we're starting to get pretty well off topic for today's episode. So if you want to learn more, unfortunately, you are going to have to kind of do that on your own. Unfortunately, I don't imagine I will be covering the different types of egg decoration anymore, so if you are interested in it, you are going to have to do that research on your own. But I did want to go ahead and bring this up, because really all I'm trying to say here is that all over the Slavic world, there are egg painting traditions, and each tradition is a little bit different, and of course each tradition is expressed a little bit differently in each individual culture. I know it's easy to sometimes think of Russia as the kind of center of Slavic culture, and to be fair, the Russian Empire, the USSR, and the Russian Federation have actively tried to push that story, but it's simply not true. Russia is not the center of all Slavdom, and each Slavic culture is unique in its own ways, and each one deserves recognition. So really, at the end of the day, I just want people to know that pisanki are not Russian, but rather they're Ukrainian, and to make clear that both Russia and Ukraine have their own unique egg-based art traditions that, while are certainly similar, are in fact unique. But anyhow, back to the story of Faberge. People are lacquering eggs and painting them and giving them to each other as Easter presents. Go Jesus, go spring, all that. But this is how peasants do it. And the Tsar, well, he ain't no peasant. He is not about to go get his wife some crummy old egg that popped out of some chicken somewhere. No sirree. He's going to get him a fancy egg. So, that's why he comes to Faberge. He requested that Faberge make his wife a fancy egg as an Easter present. This would be the very first Faberge egg. And unlike the other Faberge eggs that would follow, this one's pretty modest in its appearances. I said I wasn't going to do audio descriptions, but for this one I think it is important because it's the first one, and it is so strikingly different than all of the others. This egg is what is known as the hen egg. The hen egg was the size and shape of a normal egg, and was made of an enamel outside with gold lining around the inside of the egg. So basically on the outside, looks pretty much just like a normal egg. But the inside is coated with gold, and in the center of the egg was a solid gold yolk. But the yolk itself wasn't solid. Inside the yolk was a solid gold hen. But neither was that hen solid. And the hen opened up. The Russians really do fucking love their nesting dolls. And inside the hen was a very tiny replica of the Russian imperial crown and was adorned with rubies and diamonds and such. So, there you go. That's what the Tsar is handing out. As you can see, it's a smidge different than the normal Easter eggs that people are giving out at the time. Those generally didn't have a lot of solid gold in them, And as you might expect, the Tsarina fucking loved it. And, well, so did everyone else who heard about it. Faberge was making quite a name for himself with his little egg. So much so that the Tsar Alexander came back to him and said, "Yo, I love this egg shit you got going on here. You got any more of these things?" And Faberge was like, "Yeah, sure, I can keep you supplied with eggs." So a deal was struck and a tradition was made. For the first egg, the Tsar had known the plan. He knew what the egg was going to look like, he knew what was going to be in it, how big it was going to be, all that kind of stuff. But from now on, things would be quite a bit different. This time, Faberge had basically free reign to do whatever he wanted, and he didn't have to tell anyone. So, he didn't. All of the eggs that would come after this would be total surprises. The only rules that Faberge had to follow were that each egg had to be unique, there could be no repeats, and that the eggs all had to have a surprise inside. Again, the Russians and their nesting dolls. So, with this very limited oversight and, basically no rules at all, Faberge would get to work making eggs. Or, well, actually, no. No, he wouldn't. What I mean by this is that Faberge never actually made the eggs himself. He never actually made any eggs at all. There's this thing that happens in art and art history, particularly with people who are not super into art history, where they attribute works entirely to the person whose name is on the work at the end of the day. But this isn't entirely true, and sometimes it isn't true at all. Most of the greats out there in the 1500s or the 1800s or now had a workshop where they employed anywhere from a few to sometimes even hundreds of people to work on art. Faberge was no different. The House of Faberge, the official name of Faberge's workshop, employed roughly 500 designers and craftsmen at its peak. It was the largest jewelry firm in all of Russia. So, what this means is that Faberge never actually laid his hands on the eggs until they were finished. He did oversee the creation of the eggs, and he did help design them, but it was not Faberge who actually made them. Even though it is his name that got remembered, because it was his company, it wasn't him who actually brought the eggs into being. Instead, there were two master craftsmen who are generally credited with being the biggest hands-on creators of the eggs, these being Michael Perkin and Henrik Wingstrom. And there were many, many others who have been lost to history who also helped make Faberge's eggs. So next time you think about, look at, hear, or talk about Faberge eggs, remember the legions of nameless people who have been lost to history who were the real craftsmen of these legendary eggs, and don't let Faberge himself take all that credit. But anyhow, Faberge and the Tsar were locked into their egg agreement, and the House of Faberge began making eggs like nobody's business. And these eggs were going to be a lot different from the original one. The original hen egg was about the size of an egg, and externally looked a lot like an egg. The outside was not particularly gaudy or flashy, and only once you opened up the egg would you find all the gold and diamonds and riches and whatnot. The next eggs that would be produced by the House of Faberge would not be like that at all. From here on out, the eggs were going to be flashy, ornate, opulent, and in your face. They could have lattices of gold and silver or colored enamel sides, or could be crusted in diamonds, rubies, sapphires. These things were a real lot to look at, and they stopped being normal egg size too. The original one was as small as these would get, about 3 inches tall, but they could be as large as 6 inches tall. And for our correct-minded non-American friends, their height ranged from 8 to 15 centimeters. And as the Tsar had originally commanded, each egg had a little surprise inside of it. They were usually somehow related either to the imperial family, Easter, or spring. As I said before, I highly recommend that you go look up some pictures of these eggs at some point. I don't really feel like I can give you a great description of them because they are really ornate. So if you want an idea of what I'm talking about, go ahead and look these dudes up. But where we are in the story, most of the eggs haven't been created yet. After being commissioned by the Tsar, the House of Faberge would only create an egg a year for the Tsar to present to his wife on Easter. Well, that is until the Tsar died. The Tsar Alexander III died in 1894 and left his woefully unprepared son, Nikolai II, to run the country. We've discussed this a little bit already in the Rasputin series, but it's important to note that Nikolai was a really shitty Tsar. And to be fair to him, yeah, he said as much. He was a total pushover who had little training, experience, or even desire to lead a country, despite the fact that he'd been raised with the express understanding that he was going to do that. But hey, whatever. But instead, Nikolai had spent the vast majority of his time being really into the image of empire, not so much like actually doing the empire stuff. He idolized the office of the Tsar and the institution of the monarchy. He wholly believed in the authority of his office and in the image that it put off. Nikolai was a hopeless traditionalist who saw Russia's strength in its past and feared basically anything that was new or different. So, the tradition of the eggs was something he really cared for. For Nikolai, the eggs were a way to flex the wealth and artistic prowess of the Russian Empire on its foreign adversaries, and also as a way to impress and awe the Russian public. As well, Nikolai wasn't the kind of guy to, do anything new or different, so he just kept the tradition going. But it would not be fair to say that he changed nothing at all. Now, the House of Faberge would create 2 eggs a year. One for the Tsar's wife, Alexandra, and one for his mother, the previous Tsarina, who had already been getting a nice yearly stream of eggs at this point. And so, Faberge kicked into overdrive, and all of a sudden, these little $1 million eggs were everywhere. Well, not really. In total, only about 50 eggs would be made for the Romanovs. But they gained a lot of traction, and Faberge gained a lot of fame for his eggs. And so, Faberge started making eggs for other people. The Tsar was not the only person on Earth with a ludicrous sum of money and a desire for eggs. One such enthusiast was the Rothschilds, who had an egg custom-made for Edouard de Rothschild's fiancée. So yeah, these are the kind of people who are buying up Faberge eggs. These aren't even just normal rich people. These are rich people's rich people. And this is kind of spelled out in the number of Faberge eggs that were produced. Between the years 1885 and 1917, the Romanovs had 50 eggs created, while only about 12 would be made for someone who was not a Romanov. Oh, and an interesting thing here. During the years of 1904 and 1905, the House of Faberge made exactly 0 eggs for the Romanovs. This was because Russia was kind of in the middle of the Russo-Japanese War, and then things were doing a bit of a fall apart. Eggs you can't eat were really not on anybody's list of things to do at the moment. But anyhow, rest assured that all the non-Romanov eggs, they were equally as ornate and colorful as anything made for the Romanovs themselves. So, yeah, seemingly you kind of had to be some kind of an emperor or whatever to get your hands on these eggs. But soon, the whole egg thing would come to an end. In no small part, that would be because there soon would be no more emperors in Russia. The First World War was a particularly rough time for Russia. Really, for everyone in Russia. The economy was tanking, millions of people had been sent off to war, food was becoming harder and harder to find, and people were starting to get very angry at the powers that be. And this is where things get really rough, the powers that be wanted fancy eggs, and it was hard for them to get them. But Faberge was in their corner, and he did continue to make them. Which I find kind of interesting. Faberge, the Tsar, someone else, I don't know, someone decided that in 1904 and 1905, it was too rough, and the eggs could not be made. But in 1914, 15, 16, and 17, there would be no stoppage in the egg production. So, the eggs would march on. Though, to be fair, these eggs were not of the same quality as the others. The craftsmanship was absolutely on par, but the materials were generally less nice materials as, 1, it was harder to get fancy luxury goods into Russia at the time, and 2, the economy was in the shitter in a way you would not believe. But, yet again, Mr. Faberge's making those eggs for the Tsars. So, the House of Faberge began to do what a lot of manufacturing firms of every stripe would do, because it was, wartime, and they started producing war material. Again, on top of the eggs. They produced things like metal cups, snuff boxes, and even hand grenades. I am just imagining some dude walking into the muddy fields of World War I with the most fucking dripped out, practically glowing gold hand grenade that you have ever seen. But this is when things got really bad. 1905 revolution? Faberge doesn't care. The First World War? Faberge's on it. The communists? Well, good goddamn, it is time to pick up shop and get the hell out of Dodge. So, that's what he did. Shortly after the February Revolution, and you guessed it, February of 1917, Faberge fled the country. Probably a good move on his part. I don't imagine the Bolsheviks would have been particularly kind to the egg maker of the Tsars. When he fled, Faberge left behind more or less his entire business and everything they were working on therein. And not long after he fled, the Bolsheviks seized the building and everything inside of it. Most everything was destroyed or sold off, and this would include 2 eggs that the House of Faberge was making for the Tsar for the Easter of 1917. But the Tsar would never get them. Instead, the eggs would be destroyed. Of the other 50 eggs that the Romanovs had, the vast majority of them are actually still around and are accounted for. 43 of the 50 eggs are present and accounted for, and it is believed that 5 were destroyed at one point or another, and then there are 2 that are just completely MIA. So, who knows? Maybe one day you could find one in a garage sale or something. Because, well, that is exactly how someone did find one. Someone found one in a flea market in the 1990s. So keep an eye out, and if you find one, I expect a cut because I gave you the idea, and I think that's more than fair. But anyhow, my terms aside, unlike all of these eggs, Faberge's history is actually fairly easily traced. Shortly after fleeing the collapsing Russian Empire, Peter Faberge died in 1920, and his company was passed along to his family as it had been to him from his father. Though I'm not really going to get all too much into what happens next. The Faberge company is really not that interesting once you take the Tsar and Russia away, and it's also not really Russian history anymore. So, the main thing I need you to know about the Faberge company, as far as this podcast is concerned, is that it does still exist. They still make wildly expensive jewelry for people with the wealth of nations, and they are still absolutely not at all, not even a little bit, over the eggs. A lot of their wearable jewelry, things like watches, necklaces, pendants, other jewelry terms that I don't know, have eggs on them. And this, of course, harkens back to the glory days of when they used to make eggs for the Tsar. As well, they still make eggs just on their own. Yeah, and that's something. But again, there's a certain crisis of identity baked into that. Once this company made eggs for the Tsars, and now they make eggs in collaboration with Game of Thrones. And that is not a joke. Go to the Faberge website and you can see it. It's just as wild and opulent and expensive as anything you might have seen in the Romanov collection. And there is something particularly ironic about the once jeweler to the Tsars making eggs for a book series / TV show about kings and court struggles and civil war and whatnot, when those characters are kind of indicative of the very people that once bought Faberge's products. Anyhow, there's a certain loss of self going on there, and that's a big part of why I'm not all that interested. It's beyond me now. But there is one last thing that does interest me here, and that I want to talk to you about, and that is what purpose I see in the Faberge eggs. As I said at the beginning of the episode, I am not, capital N, not, a jewelry person. I'm a very unflashy individual who does not like shows of wealth or opulence. I'm also not a big fan of the Tsar, the Tsar's associates, or the super wealthy of yesteryear, or this year for that matter. So why am I talking about this? What's the purpose of talking about something so inherently opulent and decadent? Because it proves an important point that people sometimes forget. That Russia is a place of culture as much as anywhere else is. I am aware that in the year of our Lord 2024, the Russian Federation and Russian people and Russianness in general is not super in vogue. And it really hasn't ever been, because long before the geopolitical goings-ons of today, there were a myriad of reasons that the US and its friends have dogged on Russia. But we need to remember that no matter what it is that the Russian government is doing, and how much you or I may personally hate the Russian government, which, spoiler alert, is a lot in my case, we need to still be able to celebrate the achievements of the Russian people. And while this is not really something I would normally roll out and put on the amazing achievement board, it is something that a lot of people really enjoy. The Faberge eggs are incredibly popular and are remembered, rightfully so, as masterfully created pieces of exquisite art. And we need to take a second to recognize the religious and cultural roots so deeply entrenched in the Russian identity that led to the creation of this art. Because I know there are those who look at Russia and Russianness and see only destroyers and murderers and bastards. And that's just unfair. The Russian people have contributed a lot to the cultural fabric of this world. And the Faberge eggs are a way in which they've done that. So there you go. This is why I think it's an important thing to discuss. That's why I think that in any other context, I would struggle to find much redemption in the decadent eggs of the Tsar. But for this reason, I think it is in fact a worthwhile endeavor to discuss. But for now, it's time for me to wrap this up. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, and even if you didn't, please do not hesitate to leave me a comment on whatever platform it is that you are listening on. Any and all critiques, recommendations, exaltations, or considerations are much appreciated, as comments help me make the show better, and they do make the algorithm happy, which helps me grow the show. And as well, you can follow the show on Instagram at BTRSPod to stay up to date with new episodes, and occasionally I post pictures of my cats. But I think that will have to do it for us today. So thank you all for listening. I hope everyone is having a lovely day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.